Kei Nishiyama is a former PhD student of the center. One of the first to go through since the move to UC, indeed.
Yep.
And finished with us a few years back, and now based in Japan, Doshisha University. So welcome back. It's great to see you on board again. And of course, Peter Ikashele is a very recent PhD student completing his PhD and graduating, and still has an association with the center. And the three of you have been working on this for quite a while, to facilitate deliberation in the classroom. There's been lots of meetings over the years and discussion around this, so it's great to see you all presenting. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you. I'm assuming sort of 20 to 30 minutes presentation, then we move to questions.
Yes, that's great. Yep.
Take it away.
Right. Can you see my screen? All right, good. Yes, great, fantastic. Thanks, Simon, for the great introduction, and thanks everyone for coming to today's presentation. So we really look forward to hearing your comments, opinions, and suggestions. So we are, I personally feeling very happy to at least virtually come back to the center and where I got PhD 2 years ago, and then where my heart is attached. So, today is a very special day, at least to me. So today's presentation will be given by Pierrick, Wendy, and myself, and we are deliberative democracy researchers studying different topics. But in the past few years, we have engaged in the collaborative research project on deliberation in schools. And we bring together our different expertise and different experiences. Like Pierrick used to be a high school teacher, and Wendy is a professional facilitator, and I'm a researcher of children and deliberation. And then we bring together our different expertise and then introduce deliberative theory in the classroom, and then practice deliberation with students in Canberra, and then try to unpack the deliberative potential of civic education. But today's presentation will be not about the student performance, but about the role of facilitator in the classroom, which is underexplored area. So today's presentation is actually the second time presentation. The first presentation was made in almost 2.5 years ago, and that was just 2 months after of our completion of our pilot project. So at that time, we shared our lived experiences and practitioners' experience about our project, and sharing our knowledge and experiences and very initial findings. And then we received many feedbacks and comments. And then last year, we wrote our working paper in the seminar as part of seminars working paper series. Then just a few months ago, we started to working on this working paper and revising its contents, examining the relevance of the argument, and then adding further insights or more literatures. And then we are going to submit this paper, the revised version, to the journal. So this presentation is kind of a pre-submission presentation, whereby we will situate our project into the broader academic context. And then we will share our experience of deliberation in schools project with a specific focus on the challenges that we experienced as a facilitator. Then based on this argument, we are going to theorize what it means by facilitation of classroom deliberation. So our first job is to situate our project into the broader context. So facilitator receives very glowing attention these days, especially in the public deliberation studies. So here what we mean by facilitator, well, sometimes it is called the moderators, is individuals who help groups increase effectiveness by improving process and structures and support people to do their best thinking. So in short, facilitator is a kind of enablers of better deliberations. And but a facilitator is a very, very unique individuals, at least in the deliberations, because we often say deliberation is in principle non-coercive and egalitarian practice where people share power and to make better decisions. But facilitator might be the only individuals who are allowed to use some sort of power or kind of authority during deliberation in order to realize deliberative norms. So for example, facilitator engage in various interventions, such as directing which participants talk or politely interrupting or challenging participants' talk if it is not relevant to the topic in question, or facilitators sometimes play a role as timekeeper, deciding how and when to conclude the deliberation. So in this way, the facilitator used a lot of powers during deliberation, but we do not need to say, oh, we should eliminate this power completely, because empirical studies demonstrated the importance of facilitator in public deliberation. So for example, James Fishkin's argument on deliberative poll also shows that facilitator play a very important role in enabling citizens' deliberation, better deliberation, especially in the challenging context. And the facilitator also, Jane Mansbridge, engaged in the qualitative study, and she shows the facilitator's very important role in creation of welcoming and inclusive atmosphere. And recently, Strandberg and his colleagues studied the deliberation of like-minded groups, and then they argue that the role of facilitator is very important in avoiding groupthink. So in this way, even though facilitator use power, we do not need to eliminate them. As Dilalde says, without facilitation, deliberative talk risks backsliding into discussions. So, now in this way, the role of facilitator is growingly recognized in public deliberation studies. Then now we shift our attention from public deliberation to classroom deliberation, which is the central topic today. So, especially, well, since after Amy Gutmann's very famous and popular book on democratic education in 1999, more and more scholars, practitioners, philosophers, and theorists have jointly introduced the idea of deliberative democracy into the classroom as part of civic education practice. And there are many reports and a book about the students' performance, students' activities, students' learning, and implications for curriculum designs. Like, for example, James Fishkin, a few years ago, introduced his idea of deliberative polling into the classroom, US classroom, and then tested the students' opinion change and preference change by comparing pre and post deliberative survey. And then he demonstrated deliberation contributes to development of students' deliberative knowledge or civic knowledge, civic responsibilities, and motivation for civic participation. But on the one hand, there are many studies about classroom deliberation, but on the other hand, very surprisingly little is known about facilitation. Very few studies have been made about facilitation, and we can apply the idea of facilitator or facilitation of public deliberation to classroom deliberation, and there are some overlaps, but there are some significant differences. So, for example, Diana Hess is probably one of the exceptional persons who probably the first demonstrated the unique role of facilitator in classroom deliberation. And she said that facilitators' role is very important on the one hand, but they can also be the obstacles of better deliberation. So, for example, in the classroom deliberation, many students often want to know facilitators' opinion, which may not so frequently happen in the public deliberation. Like, if we are invited to citizens' assemblies, we are interested in other citizens' opinion, not opinion of facilitator. But in the classroom, students often ask teacher about their opinion, like, hey, teacher, what do you think about it? Then, many students want to know facilitator's opinion, but they also, at the same time, do not want their facilitator to dominate the discussion. So teachers are expected to speak something, but they shouldn't speak too much. And also, because students have many conversations with teachers on a regular basis, they often know facilitator's opinion, the political preference prior to deliberation. So this may not also happen in a public deliberation. But at the same time, students work harder to understand the issue when they do not know the facilitator's opinion. So, in this way, sometimes facilitator/teacher can enable better deliberation if they express or explain their opinion. But on the other hand, they can prevent students from thinking and talking critically and creatively. So if so, our question is, what is the meaning of better facilitation or democratic facilitation? How can we facilitate students' deliberation? So, and also, how can we theorize the facilitation? in the classroom. So these are, our project is geared toward addressing these questions, and then we situate our project into the broader academic context. And first and foremost, facilitation is still, at least in the classroom context, is still an underexplored area. So we would like to know more about what it means by facilitation. And then, as for the difference with Diana Hess' path-breaking work, we engaged in more inductive studies. So Hess tried to understand the role of facilitator/teacher by observing the practice and interviewing the teacher. But we are trying to get deeper understanding of facilitation. So we engaged in more learning by doing type of research to update and examine Hess' study. Especially, we are interested in the more detailed challenges that facilitator can face. And then also we would like to theorize the meaning of facilitation in the classroom. So now Wendy will talk about our project, and Pierrick will talk about the challenges that we experienced. All right, so Wendy.
Thanks, Kay. Great. Thank you very much. So Kay's given you that background and situated us in the literature, but there's also, of course, another sort of backstory to where this project came from. And I guess I come to it partly from as a practitioner, and in quite a number of kind of workshops and so on that we run, where we have sessions talking about how can we build deliberative democracy, often a response that comes up is we need to teach deliberation in schools. So that's part of what stimulated me to come to this. And Kay and Pierrick and I would have conversations after such workshops and say, oh, you know, we should do something. And I guess we just had those conversations enough times over enough years that I finally said to the guys, look, let's just do something and stop talking about it. And so we just decided to do this pilot project. And we didn't start by applying for some funding to do the pilot project, which was probably pretty dumb. But anyway, we just thought we'd just go in and do it. So this is quite an unusual project in that sense. We really did just sort of launch in. But partway through, we got some funding from the International Association for Public Participation. They had this pitch for practice funding, which was sort of quasi-democratic in that the membership got to vote on the proposals that they liked best, and we got a bit of funding that way. But most of it we just sort of launched in and did off our own bat, as it were. And so we did this study in 2 schools. So basically, actually, I might go to the next one first. Oh, sorry, you're controlling it, aren't you, Kay? Let's just go to this one. So to begin with, Kay had connected us with the literature, and we did a plan for what this might kind of look like. And we took that plan and we approached a number of teachers in schools and worked with those teachers to develop a design to fit in with a part of their kind of curriculum, to fit in with what they were doing at schools. So we had these sessions in the 2 schools, which were like 5 1 to 2 hour sessions. And in each week, we would then have a debrief and kind of quite a deep reflection about what had happened, about the dynamics of that situation. And then we would redesign our intervention, our facilitation, our design in response to what was happening with the group. And we would also learn at the same time. So the challenges that Pierrick is going to talk about came out of our kind of reflections of what was happening, how we responded, how that worked, etc. So if you could go back, Kay. So the 2 schools that we worked with were 2 public co-educational schools in Canberra. And the first one was a primary school, Ainsley Primary, and we worked with a group of Year 5 students. It happened that they were my daughter's class. And we had 5 1.5 hour sessions with these students. We started out in both cases doing an exercise on developing good communication guidelines. I'm using my cup, which has my good communication guidelines. And that was to develop deliberative norms. And we then took them through an exercise, a deliberative exercise over several weeks. And for the Ainsley School kids, this was about how can we make things better in our school? That was the question they were tasked with. And the following year, we went to Hawker College, which is a senior college in the ACT. And we worked with a teacher, Tom Greenwell, who was teaching a global studies unit, particularly on peace and conflict, with these students who are year 11 and 12. And so we ran some classes as part of that unit. Again, we developed deliberative norms through an exercise at the beginning, but then we worked around with the question of, is Australia a peaceful nation? And did various deliberative activities around that question, which of course was very fruitful and interesting. Thanks, Kay. There were a number of challenges that arose, and Pierrick's going to tell us about those. Thanks, Pierrick.
Thanks, Wendy, for the introduction, and thank you, Kay, for the initial presentation on the literature. So yeah, I guess here I'm trying to well, we've tried to gather the main challenges that we face. So of course there are other forms of challenges, and you know, you may be willing to ask us, you know, questions about those after the talk. But I guess the main challenges, as Wendy said, emerged from our not taking, our observations, and yeah, so there are 4 different challenges, and I'm saying different, but I should also say that they're related. So the first challenge is power, the second one is inequality, the third one is diversity of expression and knowledge, and the fourth one is disagreement. What I want to say also is one common theme between these 4 challenges is that we initially identified them as in the classroom, but quite often they also reflected of other societal trends in a way. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in particular with the question of inequality. So the first challenge is relates to power. So what I want to say initially here is we didn't do like a Foucauldian analysis of power with like all sorts of dimensions but what we essentially captured is is the result of our not taking observations and the things that were most obvious. So there may be other forms or other aspects of power that come into play. So again, reflecting on that question around, you know, societal, what happens outside the classroom and what happens in the classroom is also important, because a classroom is, there are lots of stakeholders, like invisible stakeholders that are in the classroom, such as administrative authorities, such as, you know, political dynamics, such as parents, teachers, and of course students. So power is not like a unilateral sort of vertical trend, right? There are all sorts of dynamics, and if we take the examples of students and teachers, we could think that, you know, this is a strict relationship between an authoritative teacher and a relatively submitted student, but it's a lot more complex, and students do have power over teachers sometimes, such as, you know, the ability of students to complain to the principal or to higher authorities for, you know, teachers' misbehavior or something like that. So the power dynamic is not only in balance, it's also quite complex and dynamic over time. So of course there are also, as I mentioned, political dynamics that influence the values that are you know, practiced in the classroom. If we think, for instance, of, you know, neoliberalism having sort of defunding what happens in the public school system and the private school system. So we have those kind of dynamics that also affect the nature of how classroom deliberation is practiced. So we've identified 3 forms of power that were common in our classroom deliberation. The first one is administrative. So teachers as well as students have administrative roles. And, you know, this is the example of like curriculum, right? Teachers and students have to follow a curriculum in order to be assessed, in order to have sort of a relatively standardized form of assessment that reflects societal priorities or political priorities. There's also the question of assessment. Sort of every activity needs an assessment in the majoritarian sort of educational philosophy. The second form of power is authoritative. So what's expertise? Who's a relative expert? Whose knowledge is prioritized in the classroom? And we also noticed that, you know, in relation to the different topics that we talked about in the classroom, is there were some ideas that were not necessarily welcomed because of the nature of the way knowledge is accepted or not, or validated or not by the teacher and the administrative norms. So the third dimension of power or form of power is normative. And so again, this can be related to the administrative and the authoritative dimension, but it's around what's acceptable in the classroom, what modes of expression, but also what type of discourse is acceptable in the classroom. So the second challenge is relates to inequality, and here again, okay, I'm gonna go a little bit quicker. Thank you, Wendy. So we have two different levels of inequality that we noticed. And one happens at the structural level, so in relation to class or socioeconomic dynamics, to race and to gender. And another type of inequality that is predominantly, but not only, situational. What happens in the classroom, what types of pedagogies, what types of norms and practices are acceptable or not, or which one are given prominent position. So I guess what we noticed here is particularly the question around gender. Gender was a very obvious dimension, but I think Wendy is going to talk a little bit about it later on, so I won't elaborate too much. So just to put it simply, there were quite significant differences between, between male and female students in expressing their position, in particular in Hawker College. That was quite prominent. So the third challenge relates to diversity of expression and knowledge. And here, in addition to what Kay mentioned about the different roles of facilitators, we've noticed that facilitators in the classroom are boundary setters in a way, sort of they set the boundaries, and they're also gatekeepers. So what kind of knowledge is valued, what kind of communication is accepted or not. And here, the picture shows one of the year 5 students sort of project in trying to make the school or to imagine the school better. And it was clearly sort of a blue sky thinking. And we had a bit of tension with the teacher and us pursuing sort of different goals. So Wendy, Kay, and I, being coming from a very sort of open-minded, blue sky, open way, and the teacher being more concerned about something that can be practically implemented. And the fourth challenge relates to agreement/disagreement. And we found that in particular at Hawker College, there was a lot of confusion around what is a respectful dialogue, what is disagreement, and what is conflict. And when we set the boundaries of the conversation in the initial stage, students were exhibiting conflict-averse behaviors, which we've reflected upon with them at the end of the session, because that was quite obvious that everybody was quite like paralyzed in terms of communication, not being able to express ideas. So there was a lot of misperception around, again, disagreement, but also the type of disagreement that can occur in a classroom that apparently, or according to some students, reflects relatively similar socioeconomic backgrounds and share things in common. So that was quite a challenge to manage or to allow disagreement while also preserving some sort of group cohesion as well. Wendy?
Thank you, Pierrick. Okay, so then to kind of draw a bit of a sort of meta-analysis of some of these challenges that we've looked at, we're interested in some of the tensions that came up in what Pierrick described. These are particularly related to what we're thinking of as egalitarian inclusion. So it feels like inclusion or inclusiveness has become a little overused and lost a bit of meaningfulness in that. So we've been talking a bit about egalitarian inclusion as a concept to cover not just sort of inviting people in a nominal kind of way to be involved, but to have a deliberative process where people can really meaningfully participate wherever they're kind of coming from. So just to run through some of these tensions then, Pierrick talked about the power that comes with kind of expertise and with that sort of normative power. And so we might think of expertise broadly as including both kind of knowledge, but also reasoning. And we know that these are really valued in deliberation, but we can also see how they are in tension with this sort of equal participation of all people, regardless of their knowledge or expertise or of the quality of their reasoning, for example. And we really saw a tension there. And similarly, in terms of if we're encouraging that kind of plurality, so different forms of knowledge and also different ways of expression, that can also come into tension with wanting to maintain group cohesion. Now that's going to be important in terms of reaching consensus or finding common ground, which might be the aim of our deliberation, but also particularly in a setting like in schools, group cohesion is really important for students to feel a sense of belonging and a sense of being accepted. And this connects then to also how safe people feel in deliberation, and safety can also be in tension with the sort of diversity of knowledge expression, particularly when we get into the realm of kind of extreme views. And I think that there's this sense that safety means that people feel comfortable all the time. And I'll talk in a moment of how I think that safety can have a different kind of connotation there. But yeah, I think we're actually seeing some trends here where people are deliberation is being closed down because of this issue of safety. There's things that you can't actually talk about. And Pierrick also mentioned disagreement and how actually it's quite difficult to get disagreement to come up in a deliberative session quite often. And John Boswell talked about this in his recent paper, particularly when you've created this environment of mutual respect, which of course is really important for deliberation. So there's a tension there as well. So what we're saying here is that these tensions are actually really productive. Like they're not oppositions, they're tensions that can actually be good for deliberation, and that facilitators can play a key role in holding these tensions. So holding these things in tension so that there can be productivity, deliberation can be improved. So for example, facilitators can create a safe space, allowing for diversity of opinion and allowing for the discomfort that comes with that, but holding that discomfort so that it doesn't lead to people kind of leaving the space. And so that people can go into discomfort and challenge their own views, really seek to understand other people's perspectives, and that can lead to really good outcomes in deliberation. So yeah, those holding tensions is really important. So we identify then two dimensions of facilitation from this work. And the first dimension is what we call technique. And these are the communicative capacities, the skills, and the kind of interventions, the process interventions that facilitators make during group deliberation. A really important part of technique is modeling deliberative norms, so being really good at listening, for example, but also various other kind of interventions to encourage, to support, to manage. And part of this is also observing group dynamics and choosing when and how to intervene in those. So facilitated technique is really important, and probably something that we're kind of aware of that facilitators bring. But we would argue that it's actually got limits, and that some of these questions we talked about, these challenges, are not met by facilitated technique alone. For example, facilitators bring a certain power, and may sometimes have power over the people who are deliberating. So sometimes we need other kind of mechanisms to balance kind of power. Similarly, with diversity of expression and knowledge, sometimes deliberators need different ways to express, for example, through art. And that sort of goes beyond this facilitative technique. And in terms of kind of equality and disagreement, you know, a facilitator can only say so many times, would one of the quiet people like to speak, or does anyone disagree? But sometimes you actually need to provide something else to bring that stuff out up. So what is required then, we propose, is facilitative design. This is the other side of facilitation. And this is the structured activities, the tools, and the structured processes that are developed before going into the deliberative kind of session. And by this, we don't mean the meta sort of designs like citizens' juries. We mean the small scale kind of tools that facilitators use. And that might include, for example, small group work of various kinds. I've just pasted here one of our little schedules to show you the designs that we would create for the sessions. And the elements of those designs there are multiple. So the questions we might give to small groups, the way that we might mix them up, the size of the group, the specific instructions that we give people in the work that they do, you know, how long they have, all of those things are part of the design, and they're kind of tailored to the situation. So design complements technique. Often facilitators bring their technique into the design, but also part of their technique is that they assess what the kind of dynamics of the group and what is needed in terms of those kind of structural elements. So there's an interplay between the two. So just for some examples, and very briefly, we've talked a bit about the communication guidelines work that we did. So in both of the schools, we worked with the students to develop these good communication guidelines. And as many people have found, it's much more effective to get them to come up with these themselves rather than tell them this is how to do deliberation. And these are the forms that came up. But there's many different ways to do this particular kind of exercise. Another exercise that I wanted to talk about, next slide, Kay, is here's one where we tried to bring some disagreement up in the Hawker College case. And we actually designed this exercise in order to do that. And we basically got people to write down their views about whether Australia is a peaceful society, and then to think about whether they agreed or they didn't agree with those views, and then to collect the views that they disagreed about. And then we had another exercise where we actually brought those students together around those disagreements, but instead of having the people who had the disagreement, who were kind of opposing one another, we got other students in the group who were kind of neutral observers to do the deliberation after having conversations with the people who were disagreeing. It was quite complicated, but and it was only partially successful, but it was a good example of design that really responded to the challenge that we were in. And now, Kay, what's the next one? Is that, yeah, so I'm going to hand back to Kay, who's going to sum up quite quickly.
All right, okay, so yeah, all right, quick
Okay.
wrap up. So as you know, we agree that, you know, facilitation is really, really hard work and very busier than we expected. Like, you know, we have to identify challenges, and if technique is not enough to address the problem, we have to design a lot of things, and then we choose whether design or technique is best fit into addressing the challenges. So in this way, you know, we are not claiming that design is always better than technique and vice versa. You know, facilitative design and techniques are different sides of the same coin, and facilitator needs to identify challenge, contextualize a challenge, and then consider which one is best approach to address the problem, thereby encouraging the more inclusive discussions. So this is a kind of visual summary of the relationship between challenges, design, and techniques. So in this sense, you know, facilitation is a kind of, you know, I would say improvisation. We facilitator needs to deal with a lot of unplanned and unexpected type of challenges by using both design and techniques. So, you know, it's a very quick wrap up, but thank you very much, Pierre, and Wendy, for sharing our story. And thank you very much, everyone, for listening to our presentation. All right, so it's the end of presentations. Thank you.